Good evening. Hello and good evening. Hello everyone. I am Professor Harley Etienne. I am going to introduce our speaker tonight, and I'm going to do so, if you'll offer me some indulgence, I'm going to go on for a little bit and talk about her at some length. I'm not the biggest fan of long introductions, but in this particular case, I think it's warranted and necessary. In 2003, I was a new PhD student at Cornell University in the Department of City and Regional Planning. Being very earnest and curious, I learned that our graduate chair, Matthew Drennan, had published a new book, The Information Economy in American Cities, and was going to be lecturing to an alumni group for the College of Art, Architecture, and Planning. So I asked if I could go, and I got permission. Completely unconcerned with the alumni part, I went to hear him speak about the work. I sat in the back, tucked between several piles of stacked chairs, trying to stay out of the way. Not too long afterwards, this very youthful, slender, elegant African-American woman emerged in the crowd, just absolutely stunning, a very stunning designer pantsuit, blue. She was holding court. This was her space. Everyone knew who she was and seemed to be wanting her attention. I had never seen anything like it in my life. In the corner of her eye, she noticed me and smiled. At some point, I managed to introduce myself and we got to talking. I walked her back to Cornell's Statler Hotel, and we talked for what seemed like hours. At the end of our talk, she said, "When this is over, you're going to teach at Georgia Tech." 3.5 years later, she made good on that promise, and I did. I tell that story to explain that our speaker has had an impact on our field of planning through her teaching, publishing, policy leadership, mentoring, and advising, but also through her advocacy. You don't get diverse faculties by accident. You get them when people like her clear the path and support young faculty of color, as Catherine did and continues to do to this day for me. As I arrived at Tech, her advocacy and support for me increased, and we worked really well together for a number of years. Let me now turn to her formal accomplishments and accolades. Dr. Catherine L. Ross is the Harry West Professor and Director of the Center for Quality Growth and Regional Development at the Georgia Institute of Technology. She's also the Deputy Director of Georgia Tech's Tier 1 University Center for Transportation, System Productivity, and Management, a $14 million research program. An internationally known transportation and urban planner, Ross is one of the world's experts on megaregions and sustainability. Her research interests and areas of expertise include transportation, planning impact, analysis, regional planning and development, land use planning, sustainable development, quality growth, and quality growth. Her current research examines freight impact and passenger mobility options for cities and regions, including the examination of the increasing role of e-commerce and emerging technologies. Her work includes a multidisciplinary focus on resiliency, sustainability, and inequality. Over the course of her career, Dr. Ross has raised more than $70 million to support the work of her doctoral students and herself. Just for context, that's twice the cost of the construction of this building that we're in. Yeah. Ross is the editor of Megaregions, Planning and Global Competitiveness, and co-author of the Inner City Urban Poverty and Economic Development in the Next Century. For those of you who took my CRP 2000 class, this is a volume that responded directly to Michael Porter and his competitive advantage thesis. She also published Health Impact Assessment in the United States in 2014. She's authored numerous journal articles, books, and research reports, The Wall Street Journal, Urban Land, for the Urban Land Institute, the Atlanta Constitution, Journal of Constitution, USA Today, and others. Ross served as a faculty in residence at the National Academy of Sciences Transportation Research Board and has held several positions at Georgia Tech, including Vice Provost and co-director of Georgia Tech's Transportation Research and Education Center. In July 2009, she was selected to advise the Obama administration as the first ever White House Office of Urban Affairs. She served as the first executive director of the Georgia Regional Transportation Authority from 1999 to 2003, an innovative regional transportation state agency created by the Georgia State Legislature. She's a member of the National Academy of Public Administration and has served as vice chair of the AAA Auto Club Group. She's a former Urban Land Institute fellow and past president of the National Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning. Ross has served on numerous national Academy's committees, including the Transportation Research Board Committee, Executive Committee, the Urban University Transportation Centers Program, and the Board of Directors for the ENL Transportation Foundation. She is an Ohio girl, raised in Cleveland, Ohio. She attended Kent State University for her undergraduate degree, completed her Master's of Regional Planning and doctoral degree at Cornell University, and conducted postdoctoral work at the University of California, Berkeley. I'm incredibly proud to call her a friend, a mentor, and a loving good friend, and invite her here to have her here at Knowlton at The Ohio State University.
Thanks, Harley, for a wonderful introduction and for a long-standing personal and professional friendship. It's always good to come home. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. My sister graduated from Ohio State University. My best friend attended Ohio State University, and so I'm extremely familiar with your place, is how I would frame it. Jennifer, and to the faculty, thank you for the opportunity to talk with all of you this evening. A connected web of employment, transportation, culture, and infrastructure that establishes an area as a competitive global force of production and innovation. This definition is fairly well accepted globally now. And if you look around the world, this is the kind of reference that you would encounter. And it comes as a result of a lot of work done by a lot of people over the last 15 or so years, and myself included. And so what I want to do this evening is to tell you the story leading to this definition. The beginning. The surprising phone call. This all started in 2005 when I was actually an untenured assistant professor at Georgia Institute of Technology. And I got a phone call from Robert Yarrow, who was then the acting CEO and president of the Regional Plan Association of New York. It's a quasi-public MPO, and he convened about 15 people to come and meet him in Pocahontas, New York, which is the Rockefeller Brothers Center. And there were about 5 people from Europe and 10 others, and I was among the group. I wasn't sure why I was among the group, but I was there. But when he started to talk about work that he was doing with students at the University of Pennsylvania, Bob was heading RPA and also serving as an adjunct faculty at the university. He talked about the fact that they had been doing lots of mapping and forecasting, and these 4 kind of globules is a very bad way to describe it, continued to service. And so he convened this group to sort of look at this and talk about it. And when he went to the screen and put up the images, I knew immediately why I was in the room. The Atlanta region was among the highest growing of these. And so starts a long-standing and still quite resilient friendship and research that I have with him and a number of other folks. What I would like to do is to talk about and give you a comprehensive review of one of the most important trends, the megaregion. To explore the concept, its implications for urban and regional planning, the built environment, design, the quality of life I would offer, and then to look at the characteristics, the challenges, the strategies. How do we begin to think about organizing and managing these very complex regions? Let's begin with a quick look from megalopolis to Appalachia and beyond. In the 50s, you probably are very familiar with the fact that Gene Gottman coined the term megalopolis, which really just stands for a very large city. And he used this concept to describe the massive kind of activity that you see if you look at the population cities that included Boston, New York, DC, and Philadelphia. Subsequently, it became known as the Boss-Wash Corridor, What you may not know is at that point in time, the US government was putting tremendous amounts of dollars into that corridor. And if you look at it today, you can still see that in terms of modal diversity, complexity of travel options, extensiveness of the infrastructure, is probably one of the leading places in our country. I could not resist pulling this up for you this evening. Megaregions predicted, and let me share this with you for just a moment. In 1961, in the Chicago Tribune, this was published a story, this was the graphic, and it says, tomorrow's map will be vastly different from today's. Great pouches over much of it will indicate the super metropolis cities, which are already evolving out of our once separated urban centers. Published in the Chicago Tribune on July 23rd, 1961. And so it continues. The regional cities of tomorrow will be nearly continuous complexes of homes, business centers, factories, shops, and service places. We will be saved from traffic self-suffocation. Congestion is what self-suffocation is. By high-speed transportation, perhaps monorails that provide luxurious non-stop service between the inner cities of our super cities, the inner centers of our super cities, as well as links between the super metropolises themselves. You probably know we have not been saved from self-suffocation or congestion. We do not have any high-speed rail. And certainly we don't have luxurious transportation between city centers or cities themselves. If we shift forward to 2010, UN Habitat began to chronicle the rise of megacities and megaregions. And they assert the world's megacities are merging to form vast megaregions, which may stretch across hundreds of kilometers, across countries, and be home to more than 100 million people. My definition, as I began doing research, the one I put forth in 2011, is very different now. I hope you've gotten that point so far. That they really are networks of metropolitan centers and their surrounding areas, and they're linked how? Economically, environmentally, and in terms of infrastructure interaction. This is the map that I derived, really identifying for the first time ever in the history of our country, the 10 megaregions in the United States. It's a really simple map, and I was really excited because we've been working on this for like 7 or 8 years at this point in time. And I had an opportunity to present this work at the Regional Planning Association's annual meeting. Well, their annual meeting is not the average MPO annual meeting. They have tentacles deep into the private sector. So, very famous politicians, CEOs attend their annual meeting, and I was really excited to present this work, really chronicling what are the economic engines driving the United States. And one of them said to me, well, Catherine, we're really happy your work is moving along as nicely as it is, but the problem with this map is it has hard edges. And we know megaregions don't have hard edges. Well, it really perturbed me because I'm a researcher. I want hard edges so I can analyze and measure. And this soft edge stuff was driving me crazy. I will tell you over time, I step back and there's some virtue in the sort of soft edge approach to how we shape megaregions. And you can see from Cascadia in the Northwest, the Piedmont Atlantic megaregion. I will brag a bit. This nomenclature really now globally is well recognized, and it came out of my transportation, a graduate transportation class that I teach for engineering and planning students at Georgia Tech. So it's nice to travel globally. They say, hey, tell us about these megaregions with which I have great familiarity. Today, of course, the world recognizes megaregions. UN report world's biggest cities merging into megaregions. Forbes magazine, megaregions drive wealth. And of course, the Harvard Business Review, megaregions, the importance of place. This is a reference I included Connectography. It's a book written in 2016 by Parag Khanna, and he really goes out and lays it out as he sees it in terms of how things are unfolding. And he asserts, and I quote, "We're accelerating into a future shaped less by countries than by connectivity. Mankind has a new maxim: connectivity is destiny, and the most connected powers and people will win," however you define winning. But he's really making a huge statement here about this notion of connectivity, and I think connectography frames that quite nicely. So you might ask why megaregions matter. They diversify the economic base. They can accommodate this diversified agglomeration of economics that everybody talks about. Few really specify, and it's extremely difficult to measure. This megaregion scale accommodates that kind of an agglomeration. It facilitates core periphery interactions that provide influence, so you have low-cost manufacturing potential, industrial services that support the core areas, and also the local areas themselves. So there's this interactive effect that you get. And really importantly, it scales from rural to urban to global. Megaregions in the United States, why megaregions matter. About 80% of our population, the employment and related economic activity are actually concentrated within 13 existing megaregions. There's a story for how we got from 10 to 13, and mostly it's that the Federal Highway Administration has been funding this research for 16 years, and they wanted 13, and we went and found 3 more. And as it turns out, it wasn't a bad idea because it brought in even more of the country. But you can look very quickly, and I won't belabor all of these statistics, but to give you some idea, megaregions in terms of land area occupancy, about 27%, 30. Non-megaregions, the vast amount of our land, about 72.3%. Population, we flip-flop. Megaregions contain 77.8 to non-megaregions 22.2, and I'll just make those comparisons. Employment, very similar to populations. But what you don't know, and what's not here, is the fact that 87% of the revenue from Fortune 500 companies are generated in the megaregions. 95% of all patents are generated in the megaregions. In 2001, a survey done by PLOS One, they're a huge research firm, actually identified the 50 biggest megaregions in the country, and they focused on economics and infrastructure, and they concluded that 55% of the world's population lives in megaregions, and they actually explain 70% of the world's GDP. So again, these similarities are globally. The evolution of the megaregion. I'm going to tell a story. When we first started doing this research, I did a lot of traveling around to the 10 megaregions and talks, and was trying to make some connections between how we have greater connectivity, even at the local level. And so one Sunday morning I got up, and some of the people in this audience will appreciate this. I drove from Georgia Tech to Georgia. There's a little bit of animosity historically, not animosity, but a little push and pull between the Georgia and the Georgia Tech relationship. It's not all about football either, there's some other things. But anyhow, so I drove down to Athens, Georgia, which is where the University of Georgia is located. And I was giving a talking and really working with people there, looking at the possibility of using university bus systems when they're not fully employed to provide some kind of public transportation. Between Athens, where the University of Georgia is located, and Atlanta, where Georgia Tech is located, there's woefully poor transit. In fact, I would say it's negligible or non-existent. So I'm giving this talk, and I think it's going pretty well, and people are raising their hands. And then a woman stands up. Well, she was obvious because everybody else is sitting, and they're raising their hand, and she's standing, right? So I tried to ignore her, but she continued to stand. So it was clear to me that she was not going away. And I acknowledged her, and she says, "Dr. Ross, I am from Iowa, And this megaregions and regionalism has nothing that is at all remotely related to my life or what I care about. Silence. I was stunned. Because it was Sunday morning, I don't make this trek that often. So I felt like I was doing a really good thing, and what is this? And after a while, I said very quietly to her, I said, well, I'm happy that you arrived from Iowa to Athens, Georgia safely. And how did you make that trip? She said, well, I drove from Iowa to Athens. And I said, I would assume along the way you had access to use interstates. She said, of course I did. I said, when we started building interstates, we didn't start in Iowa, but I see now you're getting some benefits from that. She then sat down. It worked pretty well. I was pretty happy with that retort. I wasn't sure what I was going to say at the outset, but it worked out pretty well. So delineation methods, we all stand on the shoulders of others, particularly in the academy. And so I feel compelled to share something about the previous research that others have done and the techniques that they've used. This coming up with this idea of where the economic engines is extremely complex. And so they've used a variety of techniques, different researchers over the years, and I've had the benefit of a lot of that. So everything from graph theory, using commuting, commodities, telephone, migration flows, Markov chains, which we're familiar with, delineating functional regions. Of course, multivariate analysis is everywhere. We use that in almost everything that we do. And increasingly a focus on econometrics, analyzing spatial structures and statistics in a way that inform us about places in a way we hadn't thought about before. When we started our particular research effort, we had the benefit of what Bob had done at UPenn, but he just sort of had globules, but there was no way to characterize them or to measure them. And so I took that data back and we started measuring and mapping everything that we could think of so we could inform ourselves about what is this phenomenon, how do we characterize it. And so one of the things that we did in terms of the core areas, we looked at what you see here, agglomeration, productivity. We looked at greenhouse gas emissions, patterns, you name it, and we included it, again, trying to get our hands around what this meant. And then in terms of the areas of influence, we looked at housing, land values, future growth, commuting, a lot of data from the Woodson Pool. They do a lot of business data for counties, MSAs in the country, so we relied a lot on their data as well. Our modeling of megaregions, we first started with our first stage. It occurred over 3 stages. The first really looked at the core areas and looking at centrality and how do you measure that. The second stage was looking at functional regions, connecting them, measuring the interactions between places, the core areas, the areas of influence. And then lastly, we started talking about physical relationships. This map looks very simple, but it's very expensive. And it really reflects a commitment on the part of the U.S. government over time to continually fund us. And I've said we've been very successful. About 16 years, they have continuously funded this research. And so I acknowledge the Federal Highway Administration. And what's really nice about it is now this is the map. This is the basis of the map that they use when they talk about megaregions on the part of our government, FHWA. These structures. So that's been a really enjoyable process. Again, kind of a quick reference to our megaregions so you understand the challenges relative to the centrality, the interactions, and the physical relationships. It's interesting, everybody talks about culture and the cultural amenities, what the cohesiveness that people have in these different places around which they have different cultures. The problem with cultures is really tough when you try to bring that into a modeling framework. My doctoral student, against my best recommendations, decided he was going to tackle culture from a network analytic framework. And he took that upon himself. He started with the Registry for National Historic Places and looked at where people, indigenous, where different ethnicities located when they came to the country. And it worked pretty well, and then everybody splintered. And it's everywhere. And so it's very difficult, and so that part of his dissertation probably will not be included. in his final paper, but there is a lot of reference and not a lot of work on this because it's extremely difficult. I've talked about the global economy quite a bit, and so what I want to do now is just to show you and give you some indications of what we're talking about in that regard. And this map really basically shows you the kind of trade volumes that our country has with Canada and Mexico projected through the year 2035. And the big blue dots really measure the amount of trade and where it occurs between Canada and Mexico, and then of course with other overseas countries. And what you see is that those portals of exchange reside quite significantly within these areas that we call megaregions. And of course, the larger the blue dot, the larger the volume of trade that one might anticipate. This is our new map without borders. And as I've said, I think it in fact does represent kind of where we are. It's a bit of a jump and a bit of a change from where our initial visualization, and I could probably give you 10 other versions of this. I won't bore you with that, but just to say that we continue to sort of work on that. And you can see from the Texas Triangle, Cascadia, California, these are all the areas that you aren't surprised to see, but we just don't think this way. And that is a major part of our difficulty. So as a result of all the work that I and others were doing, I decided to edit a book on megaregions, and I invited a host of very accomplished scholars to make a contribution. And I was very excited that they all accepted. And we got started and completed the book. And one of them said to me, her biggest concern around megaregions is the fact that she thought it would actually lead to greater inequality. That she thought the smaller places and those who are most vulnerable would be lost because of the size of it. And so I think she called out a very important issue. I don't have such a great answer, except it's on the radar. And what we always want to do is really to sort of mitigate any inequality that arises, and certainly any that is operating. So I would offer that to you as one of the criticisms that I take very much to heart. I did a survey including all the state DOTs. There are 384 metropolitan planning organizations. We know what those are. If you don't, they are legally constituted entities by the U.S. government. If you want federal money, you hit 50,000 plus, you have to have a metropolitan planning organization, and planning money funnels through those MPOs to the cities and regions in which we live. So we did a survey, I did a survey, and we had about a 50% response rate from the metropolitan planning organizations, the Department of Transportation. But what surprised me out of this particular effort was the fact that both the Departments of Transportation and the MPOs centered around the same level of interest and involvement, and I expected a big separation between what the Department of Transportation does and the planning entity does. Not so. So when you talk about what does your organization need to cooperate with other organizations, they all said, of course, planning, implementation, efficiency, traffic congestion, economic development, safety and health. And so one of the things that you find when you have an issue that doesn't have a clear border, it just ignores geography, ignores state lines, those are the ones that really drive cooperation. Congestion, right? Obviously is a great example of that. So when the borders are less clear, cooperation is what people turn to. We also decided to have another look at the extent to which interjurisdictional planning is moving forward, the whole idea of collaboration and working together. And so this map, we talked to all the respondents and we asked them, tell us, we had 7, for example, in Cascadia entities, and they all said all of them have extensive interjurisdictional planning and collaboration. I was surprised. The largest number was in Florida. Maybe I shouldn't have been surprised, but I wasn't surprised about Texas. So with 60%, probably among the lowest relative to collaboration. So again, just trying to squeeze out as much information as we can with what we have set for ourselves. Okay, let's take sort of a look overseas. The overall approach that we used, we found, was actually something that a large number of people embraced. And so we looked and identified consistent patterns over the globe. And so when you look at the United States and Netherlands and China, and you look at the highest hierarchy, hierarchy 1, as we've defined it here, you find that they basically define and measure and think about their core areas in similar ways. So for example, for us, population, employment, infrastructure, productivity. In the Netherlands, the same. China, a bit different. Administrative roles, productivity, and population density. For areas of influence, socioeconomic features, geographic relationships for the US. Netherlands, I love this, the hinterlands. It's how they refer to the areas of influence, but they look at contiguity, socioeconomic features, history, and ecosystems, which I thought was a really important consideration that mostly gets ignored, but we find that in the Netherlands, and I guess I wouldn't be surprised that it popped up there. And of course, again, for China, administrative roles and population density. So you get some idea that this hierarchy of places and what's significant in trying to understand this global phenomenon is fairly consistent across the globe. The Shanghai Yangtze River Delta province contains 3 provinces, 10 cities, over 100 million people. And for a long while, China has demonstrated and really focused on integrating transportation and utility systems. I have the privilege of serving as a visiting professor at Tongji University in Shanghai. So have had lots of opportunity over the years to work and begin to understand their culture a bit better. But to sort of put the idea of scale and scope, US, scale and scope, China, mammoth differences. And so the lens that we bring to understanding the phenomena we're talking about today is quite different, quite varied, and really requires a lot of goodwill and willingness to appreciate differences as we encounter them. The European Union, I think about the fact that in Ohio, you look at Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, and you try to get states to work together. Imagine in Europe, they have to get countries to try to work together. It's an even bigger challenge. And so the Trans-European Transportation Network, they put tremendous amounts of dollars, you probably know this, to really facilitate movement within the EU in places where without that, they could not afford these capital investments, these projects. And ideally, what they're trying to do is to enhance growth and competitiveness, and of course, the dollar amount for that goes up all the time. The largest mega region in the world is in Japan, Taheyo. It's about 750 miles, contains actually the largest proportion of Japanese population. So again, just to say to you that this phenomenon is one that is happening actually almost in spite of us. So new directions. I want to talk a bit about the most recent research that we have been conducting, regional governance, megaregions, and COVID-19. And I got excited about this. One of my challenges recently has been to try to focus this geography in a different way with a different lens. And so this piece of research done with a number of my colleague, Dr. Arthi Rao, and then my doctoral student, Chisun Yu, is our most recent effort. And I'm really excited that it will be published in the Regional Studies Journal. Jennifer, of course, brings great leadership to that. It's I will tell you, it is the hardest publication I've worked on. Thanks, Jennifer. It took many years just to let you know. And what we were trying to do here, as I said, is to shift this lens. And we wanted to do a couple of things. We wanted to look at the idea of a potential regional scale framework for really understanding the COVID-19 pandemic. We used multi-level modeling. And I'm only going to give you a skeleton of this research because it's very involved, and I would do the whole lecture on just this topic if, in fact, I chose to do that. But I want to give you a skeletal outline, and you, of course, know it will be published fairly soon. So all the details and any questions you might have that I don't cover, we don't have time to cover, is certainly there. And then we wanted to look at the longitudinal influence of spatial structures on COVID-19, and we use the intra-class correlation coefficient to do that. One of the things that you find is that with the pandemic, actually megaregions probably had higher rates and were hit earlier because of the density. And if you just think about that, it makes some sense that would be the case. So the methods and the data that we used is indicated here. We actually used data from March 22, 2020 to March 22, 2022, 3,100 contiguous U.S. counties. We used counties and then aggregated up when we needed to do our analysis. Our dependent variable is really the cumulative COVID-19 case rate. We're trying to get our handles around that. Again, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but again, I want to give you some idea of what the data was, and you can see here we use county health rankings, looking at the level 1 independent variables for the county. Always the dependent variable is the cumulative COVID-19 cases per 100,000 population. And then level 2 was really looking at the mega region. And we had really good results. So if you look at this graph, what you'll notice, everything in pink is in fact the onset of the disease, and it's moving through 2020. And if you look at this gold line, it's the mega region boundary, and then the state boundary is in blue. And you can see from April 2020 all the way through July, the mega region, the yellow, does a better job of explaining COVID cases than do counties and the state. This is quite a important finding. And so very early on, a mega region structure would have done a much better job of tracking and predicting the COVID case rates than our counties. Of course, we get to July 2020, the counties and the state step in, they have lockdown, a number of policies, and then of course they do better. But at the very beginning, in fact, the work that we did demonstrated the importance and the application of the mega region in a fundamentally different way. So the results we need for a mega region governance structure, the multi-level investigation that we did suggests that the impacts of mega regions and those with the COVID-19 case rates are independent of county effects. And the temporal change really showed that mega regions explain more variance in COVID-19 case rates in the beginning of the pandemic before policy actions from states became effective. And I'm rushing because I hope we have some time for discussion is what I'm hoping for. And what I would do by way of sort of concluding my remarks is to give and put out a call to action, urging us to build cooperation for regional planning, infrastructure investment, and the management across governments and economic sectors to really realize the potential of mega regions and really to stay globally competitive. I think this long vision is what is warranted, and the idea that we have, which is sort of 150, 150, 150, is silly within the context of what's happening in the world around us. So thank you, and I'd love to have some discussion and questions.
Yeah, bring it.
Yes, I'm thinking about Sassoon's work on global cities. Wondering what's the impact, any of these global cities, mega regions, are they a part of the mega regions, or are they separate and impacting in some way in terms of economic growth and general development?
So Sassoon's work, as you know, lays out a wonderful conceptual platform. And so, of course, there's a lot of overlap. What I have been focused on doing is bringing more of an empirical focus to that after delineating them and describing what we think they do globally, and how the U.S. in fact has these geospatial structures. We just don't address them. So I would say there's a lot of overlap, but the difference is I think the work that I and a number of others have done brings more of an empirical focus, or is at least attempting to do that, so we can better understand what these geospatial structures really potentially could offer.
Other questions? Yes, Shenhua.
First of all, thank you so much, Dr. Rose, for your so powerful and insightful presentations.
Thank you.
And as a scholar of originally from China, and I also appreciate that you mentioned about this global perspective of megaregions. I have been doing this kind of work primarily focused on transportation system for long, like high-speed rail. And one of the key kind of phenomena that we have seen in many countries, like China and Japan, that I've been experiencing is that, well, we have seen the megaregion has been developed, a lot of prosperity, on one hand, but also on the other hand, we have also seen some other city has been declining because of this so-called siphon effect.
Right.
Some of the resources has been reshifted to megaregion, so that caused some kind of regional inequality issue.
Yeah.
I guess in the U.S. We don't have a high-speed rail, but we also certainly have some other kind of modes. So I would love to hear your perspective, as a planner, how we are positioning to address such kind of issues.
Well, that's a big issue, and it certainly is one that has been and will continue to be upon us. On this idea of, and I'm from Cleveland, as you know, and a lot of what we're seeing in the northeastern part of the United States relative to just the siphoning of population, even, is certainly a major consideration. I think we have to figure out, in some ways, how we try to balance and help those places that need redevelopment, and rather than sort of closing the door and locking it and walking away. How do we reinvigorate, make new investments, and help them become places where people can find employment, want to live again, have a high quality of life. It seems to me that's what the government should do. It seems to me that's what taxes should do. So I am all in that space that says that is the challenge that we have, and we ought to all be working toward it. And I must say, I'm very disappointed in many instances with the leadership that I think to some extent doesn't get it, or at least they've forgotten it, or they never had it, I don't know. But right now, it's pretty dismal when we talk about the kind of quality of life issues, health issues, mobility needs, those who are really without resources, the health care, we're the richest country in the world, we have one of the worst health care systems in the world. There's something wrong with that, very wrong. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much for that presentation, and thank you so much for your maps. I did an architectural design project many years ago about megaregions and high-speed rail, and I looked at your map, and for the record, I never thought there was anything wrong with it.
Thank you.
So I'm coming to this from a design perspective, and I was really taken with the way that you were accounting for the variables of data, the things that were qualifying for the different ways that you were modeling a megaregion. Right. I wondered, does the role of water ever become part of the conditions of megaregions? Because I know urban investment has a lot to do with connections of watersheds or beautifying lakefronts and waterfronts. Like, is water at all an asset or a condition by which you measure the quality or the aspiration of a...
Yes and yes. And let me tell you why. The water wars, Georgia, Florida, and Alabama, fighting over the headwaters for the Chattahoochee River. And of course, we've been in court forever. I think Atlanta won the last tremendous. I left Georgia Tech for 4 years to run a statewide transportation authority when we had a conformity lapse. And they took away all federal dollars from Atlanta. They said, oh my God, the Republicans, the Democrats, the business, everybody was kumbaya, get money back quickly, because they took away all federal dollars. And so I stepped into that for 4 years to run an authority. But even then, now these water wars, water is becoming a very important variable. When I'm traveling globally and we talk about what are our most pressing problems, I talk about congestion. The rest of the world talks about water. and increasingly water is a resource, and the access to water is a critical factor in terms of sustainability, resilience, and in terms of having some of these places be able to continue to exist even because the lack of water. So absolutely, I didn't bring any of that with me, but I have a lot of work that we've looked at water basins and how important they are, and that they ought to be one of the things you focus a mega region around to some extent. That the allocation of adjustable, really more equitable and a justifiable allocation of water resources ought to be a part of what we plan for instead of going to court, as many of us do, fighting over a valuable resource. So thank you for bringing that up. I feel like I should have mentioned that, but I'm happy that you asked the question. Yes, sir.
Thank you for this. I'm glad that I could attend this. So my question is, Thomas Friedman, who said the word is flat, and Richard Florida said the word is spiky. And so, as you said that, as you shared with us in the anecdote that Iowa is also benefiting from the
Right.
what would you say is happening to the world now? What are the Megaregions doing in this scenario of spiky and flatness?
So I guess for me, I don't get so much impressed with spiky or flat. I really more like to talk about sort of what's going on inside and what does it mean for us, the people who are residing in these places. I know Richard quite well. We're good friends. And so, I'll be a little snipey. His first notion of mega regions was, fly the globe and then the lights light up and there you see, that's how you know where everything is located in the hot spots in the world because it's well, yeah, except for water. Exactly, thank you. Yeah, can't see the water. But I guess what I would offer is, it depends upon your lens. If you look longitudinally, there's certainly spikes that all of us would agree exist. But they tend to ebb and flow is how I think it works. And it becomes circuitous in some ways, and so I would offer that those aren't really a juxtaposition, but it's a question of timing and lens and observing what is more prevalent at any point in time.
Other questions? Yeah, Amber.
Please.
Echoing again, thank you. This was a lovely talk. Thank you so much. My question is about using the notion of megaregions to understand risk. So that could be from a water perspective, ecosystems perspective.
Yeah.
See what just happened with Philadelphia. They had the water supply was contaminated, ground rushes on stores to try to get bottled water. So there's this this kind of cluster density effort of
Yes.
not only people working, but the infrastructure itself. And so I guess I'm kind of curious on how you can use information about ecosystems, about administrative decision making as part of that mega region data set. Like, is there a way that you can capture that risk empirically?
Sure.
Transparent?
Sure, and it ties back to the question of water resources management. Ecosystems require water, as you know, and the maintenance of those. So I think that's very easily captured. There's lots of data that you could certainly bring to this perspective, and we actually started modeling. We looked at federal lands, parks, green infrastructure in different cities. We didn't get as far as I had hoped we might get with that, but certainly it's very easy and should be appropriately. There ought to be a green infrastructure plan, it seems to me, for everywhere that we live, right? For all kinds of reasons. I won't even go into them because we all know them. But yeah, so I applaud you in that regard. I think, yeah, there are many ways to actually include that, and it should be, and in fact, it is a large part of what some researchers have done, and we certainly have looked at it and I didn't include it here, but we spent some time on that.
Should we take one last question? Yes, sir.
We have two, Harley, because there's one in the back and one here.
Go ahead, please. Oh, okay. Thank you for your lecture. So you had mentioned, the classification of the urban area being 50,000 or greater.
Yeah.
I was wondering if there was any research that you have done or have looked at that structure of that 50,000 classification. This is a transportation planner. I see issues where you have a very large area next to an area that has an MPO of like 55,000 people, and that area projects or even work together with that larger community, especially in the light of things like distribution centers and factories coming up in sort of these ex-urban areas. Just wondering if you have any insight on that, if there's any research being.
Well, I think we actually ought to go up from 50,000 in some instances. Not everywhere. We ought to have more of a sliding scale than we do now. I testified before Congress, not last year, I guess it was. And one of the issues that came up was the size of these MPOs and people being terribly concerned that if I'm 49,999, I'm not an MPO and I don't get money. Actually, it's so many people of different political arenas, let me say, calling me about that, trying to bias my comments before I even testified, which I shook off, I promise you. I think one of the biggest fights that happened recently, you might have missed it, is they tried to realign megaregions and to say, okay, some of these smaller MPOs, some of these smaller areas should coalesce and become a larger MPO. The Office of Planning, FHWA, got shot in the foot on that. People love these MPOs like you love your car. I'm joking, but I'm just trying to say you wouldn't think, because it's tied to federal money, and so we know some of that. But I think your observations are accurate, and there eventually will be some movement. In preparation for this lecture, we now have something we call the 3C comprehensive planning process. I went back to try to say, well, what did we have before that? Because I'm trying to figure out what do we have past MPOs now. I didn't have much luck because we didn't have very much before that. And of course, the guess is what comes next. But I do think what comes next has to have more of a global orientation than we currently have. We plan, Atlanta for, it's just, and that's okay, but you have to be able to talk about that in terms of competition. When Kia located a plant, they located on the line between Alabama and Georgia. Why? Because they got two states. I mean, that's how, they don't locate in one place now. They're not going to Mississippi. They might go to a subset of that. So this idea of bigger, some planning lens that resonates in the global world is something we are really missing. And we're getting behind, I can tell you, competitively. So you used a more local, but I think the same problem exists in the example that you gave.
Thank you.
Mara's question is going to be tough, so buckle up.
Bring it on.
Okay. Well, I was just thinking of this call to action to build cooperation. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were on like how to do this at the mega-region scale, considering all these competing forces and laws and politics in different states, and like even at the sub-regional level, there is that conflict sort of on one aspect. So like, what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question. So my thoughts are that all places are not created equal. Some places, if they don't work, our country doesn't work. So we need to quit being silly, identify what are the critical priorities. They have to be funded, they have to work, they have to operate, and you need to know you're number 2 or 3 or 4, or maybe further down the line. We have this sort of 150 mentality, which is fine in many instances. But to the question that you're raising now, we need to make those economic engines, if they shut off, we're in trouble. I can just tell you that. We don't plan for them in a way that makes any sense, but they drive the economy in our country. But have anybody asked you about, let's go do planning for mega regions or for looking at the economic engines that drive our economy? No. So my answer is essentially that we aren't getting it right. And these places, all places aren't created equal. They're just not. Chillicothe, Mississippi is not as important as Atlanta. If you think it is, you got problems. If you can't, I'm just trying to make a narrative. So what kinds of resources do we need for that? And what kind of resources do we need for Chillicothe, Mississippi, for example? So I think we're not having good, honest conversations about those distinctions.
Let's thank Dr. Ross for her wonderful talk and answers to the questions.